Guess I'll get started. And if anyone else joins us, then they can join. But please, everyone, I hope you've gone and helped yourself to some food. Okay, well, I will say good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Hayat Iman, and I am the Research and Evaluation Lead at the Laidlaw Foundation. And today I'm thrilled to be your moderator for this afternoon session. I would like to begin today's session by honoring the land we are on, which has been the site of human activity since time immemorial. It is the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, Confederacy, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River First Nation. These nations and this land were subject to the One Dish, One Spoon, Wampum Bells Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the land and its resources. Other Indigenous nations, Europeans, and newcomers were invited into this covenant in the spirit of respect, peace, and friendship. We are mindful of broken covenants and strive to make this right with the land and with each other. We are all treaty people. Many of us have come here as settlers, immigrants, newcomers in this generation or generation. We acknowledge those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade, and so we honor and pay tribute to the ancestors of African origin and descent. We acknowledge that we are settlers, and we stand in solidarity with the Indigenous peoples. We recognize our role as individuals in the work of reconciliation. We commit to doing the work and to learning. So, as I mentioned, I work for Laidlaw Foundation, which is an organization that is committed to advancing the rights and well-being of youth, especially those who are systematically underserved and overrepresented in the education, child welfare, and criminal justice. We do this by funding youth-led, community-based, and systems-focused initiatives across Ontario. One of our key programs is the Nathan Gilbert Youth Innovation Fellowship, named after Laidlaw's former executive director and lifelong advocate for equity and youth leadership. This fellowship supports young changemakers who are using research to advance justice and systemic transformation in their communities. We are very excited to be showcasing the work of two brilliant individuals, the 2024 Fellows, Kenneth Aliu, who is in person with us today, right here, and Johne Quiambao, who is joining us virtually from Ottawa, who's online. That is on right now. So as part of this fellowship, each fellow led a self-directed year-long research project designed to advance our understanding of issues facing young people in Ontario. Today, Kenneth and John will introduce themselves, share insights from their work and findings, and reflect on their experience conducting this research, which includes their challenges, breakthroughs, and lessons learned along the way. So before we begin, I will give you a brief overview of the agenda. So welcome and opening remarks. That was now. Presentations, Kenneth and John will present. Then there's some time for Q&As. We kindly ask that you hold your questions until the Q&A section, just so that they can go through the presentation. Also, as I mentioned before, please feel free to enjoy the sandwiches and wraps that have been provided. And with that, I am pleased to welcome our first presenter, Kenneth. His work examines the criminalization of Black youth with disabilities and proposes interventions rooted in care and equity. Oh, yes, she's going to put it
on. Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you. Nice to be in the community with you guys. Kenneth Aliu. I am a Laidlaw Fellow, very proud Laidlaw Fellow, to be honest. And did my BA in Ottawa, obtained University in Transnational Law and Human Rights and African Studies. and I went to University of Cambridge, where I was in criminological research studying drug policy for a year and a half. And this topic came up as a result of my being a young policy advisor in one of the only Black-facing B3 organizations, Ashare Community Foundation with Disabilities, where I learned a lot about the stake and some of the harms, and but also some of the possibilities of having disabilities or being disabled. And so this research should be an hour long. We're not going to be an hour long lecture for you guys. I've condensed it to 25 minutes. But you guys can ask me questions if you are long also. I'd like to have an active conversation. So they're never taken seriously. Blackness, disability, education, and criminal legal system. Never taken seriously came from prisoner explaining some of the consequences when they ask for help within the criminal justice system. They applied as someone that is disabled is never taken seriously. When they go and seek psychiatric help, what happens is that the social service workers use that against them in a sense, but there's also comparative in the sense that the pain is not given full attention, as opposed to white prisoners, where they care more for the white prisoners as opposed to the Black prisoners. So I'll begin my introduction by talking about the kind of Black population is growing, right? The kind of Black population is growing, having doubled from 1966 to 2016 with a significant youth demographic. Evidence shows that Black youths and children continue to live in poverty and overrepresented in the child welfare system. Black youths are also disproportionately affected by gun violence, often victims of the criminal legal system. Additionally, evidence shows that Black people with disabilities are one of the most vulnerable populations in the areas of health, employment, immigration, education, and the criminal justice system. The nexus of poverty, racism, and ableism shows that Black people with disabilities remain unable to secure their own well-being and effectively locked out of the Canadian life. For Black disabled individuals, the convergence of race, disability, and other identities contributes to their unique vulnerabilities and marginalization. The intersection of anti-Black racism, ableism, gender discrimination, and transphobia creates compounded challenges for Black disabled persons, which exacerbates stresses in all aspects of their lives. So before I begin my topic on disability, I tend to begin with a theoretical. So what is disability? There is no one definition of what disability is. In fact, there are multiple perspectives. But overarching perspective of disability has been the medicalized model of disability, right? And the medicalized model of disability locates disability as being a problem that needs to be fixed, as something that needs to be dealt with. That is Stroh when defined it in 1996. In the 1960s, a paradigm shift came where we looked at disability more as a social problem and a social model of disability as opposed to medicalized. What does this mean? The social model of disability considers the disability in a broader sense, moving beyond the medical impairment to understanding disability as an impairment that arises from the relationship between the person and the individuals with their relationship with physical environment. So that is using a wheelchair, for example, is not inherently a disabling condition, but it becomes so when the person in the wheelchair confronts staircase instead of an elevator, right? So the social model of disability does not contest the idea that some disabilities cannot be profoundly limiting, even though some scholars have said that that is archaic. But it shows that, especially in disability law, that society is not neutral, that our biases are built into the very structure, the norms, and the practices which can then produce disability. In fact, the most philosophical literature, they'll tell you that time will make everyone disabled at some point. Because at the end of the day, we're going to be old. Right? And in this sense, some conditions that we consider as disabling or inherently impairments, and not just that, but rather, when coupled with an unwelcoming social setting, can create certain disadvantages. I also begin my understanding of disability from a critical disability theory standpoint. My friend, a legal scholar, Joshua Seeley, reframes the discourse around disability as one not just a biomedical impairment, but a discourse that is connected to the structural, the economical, the political, the legal, the cultural, as well as the unequal. And it poses this critical question in terms of disability and the law, that for the law to empower people with disabilities, it must ask a second question. If the law can be understood as a set of rules and a system of rules, critical disability theory keeping disability in mind, asks us, what are the natures of this rule, right? Who constructed this rule? And what interests do they serve? And so, in that sense, it brings about the idea of the disability rights versus disability justice. Disability rights consisting of legal rights and legal equality for people with disabilities. When we move away from that, from disability, go into disability justice, one that focuses on race, gender, sexuality, the nation state, colonialism, imperialism, and the ways by which imperialism and colonialism have shaped the way we understood disability, specifically in relation to blackness. But also, it is intersectional and anti-capitalist. It allows for cross-border and the collective liberation for everyone. It's my argument then that the Canadian landscape needs to move from the medicalized mode of disability, which is very much present, as you see in my presentation, into the social cultural understanding of disability that acknowledges the existential condition of precarity for Black people with disabilities and the involvement within the legal system. It's a recognition that all lives are enriched and made possible through a variety and a means of support. And go to the next one. So before I begin my topic on the school prison pipeline, I want to talk about eugenics because I went back to the pipeline to go see what was happening within the criminal justice system and what was actually going on. So from 1865 to 1883, Francis Galton, who is known as the father of eugenics, formulated a theory of eugenics to refer to the social study of agencies under social control that may improve or impair the racial qualities of future generations, either physically or mentally. He asserts that selective breeding or eugenics can be defined as a selective reproduction can solve the social ills that beset breeding. Canadians living with disabilities have historically encountered systemic exclusion, marginalization, and discrimination. In fact, Canada instituted discriminatory policies that have restricted the immigration of persons with disabilities, forced sterilization, and institutionalization. Canada's immigration policy from the 1800s was a deliberate project of replicating white British society, and those who were not white were seen as undesirable and unassimilable. Racialized people who were recruited for cheap labor and under restrictive immigration policies that still continue to exist today, but under a different name called the Temporary Migrant Workers Program. The eugenics model conceptualized disability as being in the individual body, and that's very important. And disabled people were unfit to live within society. In fact, the eugenics worldview exists in a binary. And you know what exists in a binary? Colonialism. As one of those two classes that we consider fit or unfit. Those unfit created the foundation of what is considered disability today. Within the eugenics model, economics of political realities such as poverty are not only rooted in injustices, but due to genetically inherited traits. Social conditions and inequalities were considered individual heritable traits. The eugenic model constructed disability with such rabid contempt. Proponents would and did anything to get rid of the problems of disabled people, even killing them. This was the case in Canada in the 1850s. This was the case in Ontario, Manitoba, BC, and Alberta in the 1970s. The eugenics model was very successful in influencing governmental policies in the United Kingdom and the United States, particularly in Canada, for instance. Liet Morshy, the disability scholar from the University of Illinois, and I quote, that eugenics was not just an interlocking system of oppression. At times, it centered and construed the morality of sex workers, unwed moms, convicts, but at other times, race, and other times, perceived unintelligence. All of these aspects were considered to apply to all those deemed unfit. Eugenics conflated immorality and unintelligence, often articulated this imagined deficit in racial language. It was centrally about disability, but it was also centrally about race, and it was also centrally about class in general. In fact, in 1966, eugenics was written into the Canadian Immigration Act, right? In the ways by which they construed people coming into the country as people with mental defects or physical defects. And they were connected to criminal behavior and antisocial behavior, right? Canadian immigration policy has always been rooted in racism, sexism, classism, ableism, where historically these ideologies have worked to restrict racialized groups, specifically Black people with disability. During the transatlantic slave trade, for instance, Black people and Black children were not necessarily seen as fully human. Enslaved Black people were seen as lacking sentience, possessing a limited ability to feel pain, and were represented as hypersexual and dangerous. Now we come to the school to prison pipeline system. And what the school to prison pipeline is a system. Anyways, I'll define it for you. So the school to prison pipeline system is a system whereby schools and disciplinary mechanisms within schools funnel children into the youth juvenile system. What happens is that I went back into history to see how this was happening, what led to this phenomenon. Prior to the 1980s, school boards were not required to provide special education to students with disabilities. As a result, students with disabilities were often referred to, in my language, as trainable retards, right? And received no education or segregated education program. It was not until the 1980s when the 82 boards were then compelled to provide special education for students. The Ontario Safe School Act was introduced in the 2000s within a discourse of zero tolerance policies, solution for publicly perceived problems of violence and behavioral issues in schools, such as bullying and bringing weapons and drugs in school. The Safe School Act was meant to provide a safe environment that best suited for learning. What this did was that it disciplined students with disabilities, and the Mike Harris government at that time had said that it was intended to promote respect, but the effect upon students with disabilities was quite disrespectful. It's important to note that this was by design because a monograph by the government showed that the government actually knew what was happening, the impact. In fact, the Mike Harris government, in a report that came out, the Special Education Monograph #5, they stated, and I quote, some students who have violent outbursts not wholly responsible for their behaviors. Some students with severe disabilities have varying levels of understanding, controlling acceptable behaviors. These students may need additional support to understand, change, and demonstrate acceptable behavior consistently over time, right? What happened was that the Safe School Act, coupled with the zero tolerance policy, allowed for the suspension and expulsion of students, particularly in marginalized neighborhoods. So Black and brown students have been shipped out of the education system, shipped into the legal system. In fact, Rankin and Contenta in the Toronto Times in 2009 did an analysis whereby they referenced TDSB, Toronto District School, prison data, showed that Toronto areas with the highest suspension and expulsion rate were the same areas that had the highest incarceration, right? So students were being pushed out of schools and into the juvenile system. When we look at the stats today, we see the perceptions of discriminatory attitude. That Black students are 7 more times more likely to be perceived discriminatory treatment by teachers compared to white students. They're proportionately more likely to receive suspension and expulsion rates. Particularly, it's important to understand that in every of these situations, every of these stats, it is Black students with disabilities. It is Black students with disabilities that they were the ones being targeted by this discriminatory policy. It also brings up the case in the Peel region, where a Black girl was seen as subhuman. And while she had some learning difficulties, she was tackled by the Peel police forces and sent to the police. She was 9. Right? If education is the bedrock of society, as Stats Canada have said, and during economic downturn, unemployment rates for those that did not complete high school tend to be astronomical. You often wonder then if Black students and Black students with disabilities are not necessarily finishing school. How do they intend to get jobs? How do they intend to get housing? How do they intend to contribute to the economy? As such, in this case, anti-Blackness that is quite historical seeps into this consciousness and allows for disabling of this community. And this is my first intervention during my research. The idea that what has been largely ignored when we think about disability has always been the impairment facility. But we haven't looked at the ways by which structures, institutions, politics tend to disable communities, thereby bringing out people with disabilities. Then we medicalize, we stigmatize, and then we use disciplinary mechanisms to organize this populace, right? It's as what Foucault said. Foucault said that the idea that power is not necessarily within the institutions or within the structures, but within the strategic situations that exist within society. It's also important here I draw on the fact that this was in the Black Toronto community support. Right? This is a situation that I was doing my research, but this situation was actively happening. So it wasn't enough that I was seeing the historical legacies of anti-Black racism from enslavement in Canada to the era of eugenics, to the era of the school to prison pipeline. But I was doing this study, I've also seen the ways by which Black students continue to be policed, criminalized, and stigmatized by disciplinary mechanisms, right? And so that was very fascinating to me. In the last section, because I'm summarizing this, so I'm jumping, I'll talk about the policing system as well as the criminal legal system as a whole, the ways by which artificial intelligence that exacerbates it. I see artificial intelligence as in multiple possibilities, as John will explain to you. But I also see the problems that it might surface as a result of. And this is because I reject the idea that artificial general intelligence is going to lead us to this kind of utopia. Not understanding that artificial intelligence, in this case, is the philosophical foundation borrows from the era of eugenics. The way we think about transhumanism, the way we think about altruistic empathy in a sense, the new side, altruistic altruism, the new kind of charity that based charity upon data, right? Not understanding that eugenics was based on selective reproduction, picking up was free and unfit. That is the same logos, right? That artificial intelligence tries to. So I reject that premise that we're going to lead to utopia when right now we haven't done enough for the people that really need it the most, right? In one area of policing, for instance, police encounters and arrests have generated data for predictive policing, for predictive analytic systems, and more likely to identify disabled people at a higher rate in that sense, right? It is what this disability scholar Jamelia Morgan calls aesthetic police. The fact that we don't want to see people with disabilities within our public space. In fact, there's a whole debate about involuntary treatment for people with drug disorders, which is very, very important within the context of a medicalized model of disability. When we remove those homeless people who, by virtue, are disabled, but not because of their disability in itself, but because of poverty, the lack of house, the lack of adequate drug treatment, the fact that we're closing safe homes in essence, what we're doing is that we're regulating the social norms that target people with disabilities. That is what we call aesthetic, right? But also, what we are seeing is that disabled people are also at a greater risk of deadly force from the police. This risk increases even more with these predictive systems, right? Race and racism have become proxies for risk assessment. The proxy for race have become embedded within the algorithms. This has started since the 20s and the 30s, right? In fact, at origins, race, if you look at the Borges model, what shows that racial elements were baked into this model. So if you're white, you get a negative. If you're Italian, you get a positive. Italians and Irish at that time were racialized as black, right? Given these racist systems that focus on prior criminal history, right? The results then are skewed along racial lines. The risk prediction tools aren't predicting what we think they're predicting. They're not predicting the act, but the likelihood of being policed. Who gets arrested, who gets detained, depends on police. So you're not necessarily predicting crime. And this is what is being taught within the criminal justice systems in schools. And I went to the top criminology departments. That's what they teach the police officers, because Cambridge trains the UK police office. This is what they're teaching them on all hotspot policing, right? They're not necessarily predicting the right data, but the likelihood of based on your prior criminal records. So we're predicting based on inaccurate data. And what then happens is that because of the historical arrest data includes data from over police neighborhoods, it reflects a racially biased policing practice. And this feeds into the policing model. In fact, an example in the UK, when they checked the matrix, right, 78% of people that were in prisons were Black youths, right? And they are more likely to be arrested in the UK system. In the court system, we also see this, right? We think decision making should be instrumental in terms of sentencing. But what we are then finding is that these algorithms are not necessarily neutral. They're not race neutral in any sense. In fact, a study from Tanks showed that Black juveniles with intellectual disabilities were often judged more harshly than Black juveniles without intellectual, right? So even within Black people, we've seen the discrepancy and the globalization of people with disabilities. But more lasting, these systems are very hard to get like any kind of data or any kind of correction. Why? Because they're owned by private companies, right? Due to proprietary interest. When these algorithms are used in making justice decisions, they remain the property of the private companies that develop them. So software companies usually remain outsiders from opening what they call the black box. Right? These predictive algorithms, under the guise of protecting intellectual property, do not allow for any kind of legal measures of procedural justice to happen. Within the prison system, we can see the way by which ableism and blackness plays out, right? If we see eugenics as a kind of selective reproduction, incarceration can also be selective reproduction, where we tend to keep the people out. And in most cases, Black prisoners with disabilities tend to be more over police. 60% of all use of force bases are towards Black prisoners. In fact, these are not intervention in the sense that we don't necessarily discuss those Black people that tend to be disabled by the police. In the case of Davonta Miller, who lost his left eye by two policing brothers, and they refused to report that to me. Right? But also, 80% of those within the incarcerated, that are incarcerated are also thought to be disabled, and 79% of people in prison have mental health issues. Right? These are the things that we don't necessarily talk about. And within the prison and within prison conditions also, see the ways that many are dying in segregation. Example is the indigenous woman Kinua James, who died of diabetes after falling the prison gas for children. I'm just going to close out by telling you my three T's in this case. First is that anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism within the education and the criminal justice system disproportionately impact Black youth with disabilities by reinforcing systematic barriers and deepening intersectional reality. Black individuals in Canada continue to face compounded discrimination across education, immigration, healthcare, and the justice system. Effective solutions must address the intersectional nature of the system to ensure equitable outcomes for Black disabled youths and Black communities. The second one is that the philosophical foundation of artificial intelligence can be traced back to the rise of the eugenics movement in the 19th century, with figures like Galton and Malthus shaping their ideological framework. AI, like eugenics, is fundamentally concerned with optimizing human intelligence through selection and efficiency. While the stated goal is to enhance human capability and simplify daily life, its core principle part of the rhetoric and legislative measures is totally used to regulate people with disabilities. These measures function as a biopolitical intervention that systematically excludes disabled individuals from the North American body politic. The logical corollary means that the deployment of AI in an actuarial age, shaped by programmers and data analysts, has resulted in the creation of models that inherently reinforce biases against marginalized populations. Eugenics reinforce inequality around race, class, disability, ethnicity, and indigeneity. So does AI. My final intervention is this, and this is also my challenge. More research and more funding into these multiple areas and solutions that centers the expertise of those at the front line, those who do work with and people with disabilities. Reforms must be very intersectional. Reforms must also address the compounded nature of this problem. Thank you, IAC, and thank you, Laidlaw Foundation, for this research. I'm very grateful.
Thank you so much, Kenneth, for that powerful and thoughtful presentation, and for sharing your journey with us. Now I'd like to welcome our second presenter, John, whose project explores how artificial intelligence can be developed to empower racialized communities in navigating the justice system and advocates for inclusive community-driven AI in policing and court processes. John, the floor is yours.
Hi, are you able to hear me well? Okay. Is yeah, okay. I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay. Are you able to see the presentation on the screen? Yep, okay. All right. Hi everyone, my name is Johne Quiambao. I am one of the other Laidlaw Fellows with Kenneth, and I'll be presenting my research project that I've been working on throughout this year and last year as well, AI, the legal system and race relations. So just a quick introduction of myself. I have a educational background in criminology, law, and political science. And during my education, I would say the piece of literature that really fueled my passion and interest in this topic was a chapter in the book from Sarah Brain, a sociologist, on big data and how the police have been using it, most notably in the States. And just after reading that, it made me realize how much of an issue that is and how the issue of big data in itself is going to be such a big use of currency um, in the future, and how the public may not really understand, or more or less they won't really know that, and they can't even have control of that themselves. And just to lay out the agenda for the presentation, um, the, I'll be starting with my initial project goals, the evolution of the research project, a reflection of my fellowship, and future directions. So to begin during the very beginning of my fellowship, um, I wanted to think about how we can leverage AI for positive social change, because with academic literature, there's a lot of scrutiny and criticism of how AI will affect the legal system. It would disenfranchise or devalue due process models we have in the Canadian legal system. But upon doing initial or preliminary research in AI in the legal system and the available academic literature, I found that there's a lot of Canadian legal scholars talking about the inevitable inception of AI within our legal system. So thinking about that, I wanted to think about how we can leverage it for social change if it's going to be incepted anyway. Like, how can we help the public, or even help or lean into the appeal of it, and to help with case backlog or efficiency? Another initial project goal I had in mind was to create a website or educational campaign to educate the public about the use of AI, especially in the criminal legal space, and how it may affect them, and how it may in fact affect their constitutional rights and their privacy rights as well. I think it's extremely important that the public is aware of the use of AI and how it has already been used on them um, by the policing institutions and the criminal legal system, especially when their constitutional rights um, are affected by this. And lastly, another initial project goal I had in mind was to create, or to propose to City Council, a form of a community-based AI vetting committee, because currently the only vetting agency or framework we have in Ontario is the policing institution, and it's kind of a conflict of interest when the police are vetting their own AI that they're seeking to use, and the public, there's not enough transparency with the public about how exactly is the vetting process, how are they auditing it, and what are the repercussions to the public as well. So the very first significant project milestone I had was the creation of a literature review. This helped me just orient my research and compile it into one document where I was able to articulate and express where the current literature stands and what is the current circulating discourse around the threat of AI in the criminal legal system, especially or with the lens of how it may impact racialized communities. Here, identified how perception of trust and confidence in the legal system are pivotal areas for state legitimacy in racialized communities. Um, And I would say the beginning of this literature really fueled my fire and passion for research on the topic because it informed me of case studies that happen in the States of Predpol and Clearview AI. These are tech companies that the policing institutions purchase products from to basically acquire large amounts of data, which can be like location data or even facial pictures of people. And this now becomes a part of the policing database, which they can use for whatever reason that they want, which they would not tell to the public as it's part of their policing practices. Um, Another key thing I learned about after this literature review was the lack of engagement with racialized communities in the academic research on AI in the legal system. I found that a lot of academics were using a critical race theory lens, which is very significant and important, especially when it comes to this topic. But there wasn't actually any engagement with members of the community, and there was no forms of semi-structured interviews. There was no hearing directly from them. I think it was great that the academics have there's a lot of broad overarching themes and topics that they discuss under great detail. But I think it's also really important that the the voices of the communities are heard on this topic and not only informed. Secondly, I hosted and facilitated a roundtable discussion on the importance of inclusivity in the development of AI. And this was a pivotal part of the fellowship because I was able to engage with the public, considering the lack of literature that I was able to find that was able to directly hear back from them. It was important that I was able to understand other people's perspectives, and I think it was great that I was able to learn from the participants who engaged, and they were also able to learn from me as well. It informed me of my research project going into the future because they really highlighted the other critical aspects of the socio-legal issue, such as the financial or the environmental considerations that are at play when we use AI and AI in the legal system. But going back, the main premise of this roundtable discussion was that we were able to come up with recommendations and think of ways to reconcile the lack of racialized voices in the AI development space. We came up with recommendations to invest in racialized communities research projects that look towards bringing together communities, racialized communities to think of ways of how we can combat the lack of their voices in AI spaces and how the policing institutions have the potential to use that to perpetuate systemic biases. We also thought about how we the importance of not just having racialized communities on the decision-making board as a symbol of tokenism without active decision-making powers. Following that, we had another presentation hosted and facilitated by Kenneth and I during Black History Month entitled AI Black Disabled Youth, and the Criminal Legal System. And here I wanted to focus more on the latent issues that were highlighted in the roundtable discussion. I wanted to dive deeper into the academic literature, and I wanted the participants to critically contemplate and think about the issues that were pressing, that were brought forward in the presentation. And the research report that came out of both the roundtable discussion and the previous presentation that took place during Black History Month. I created a research report using the information gathered from both of those, and I employed a critical race framework to understand how AI in the legal system disproportionately impacts Black communities. So with this research report, compiled the work and the conversations that took place in the roundtable discussion and the presentation. And I wanted to use relevant and significant literature that really dive deep into the latent issues that weren't really spoken about in the previous presentations. The research report includes a case study with Clearview AI and the RCMP, where the RCMP employed Clearview AI technology to acquire large amounts of data from the Canadian citizens of their pictures without public knowledge at all. And this was a clear infringement of privacy rights. And since then, the Canadian government employed a federal accountability framework, which is slightly vague and it doesn't necessarily have any transparency about how they actually go about it. And there's also municipal accountability frameworks that I've discussed before about how the policing institutions are the ones themselves that vet these AI technologies. As well, there is the key themes or the key analysis viewpoints that I talked about in this research report was how AI was a mechanism of state legitimacy and how AI is viewed as a neutral and objective tool without any sort of bias or partiality. And I really discussed thoroughly how AI can't be seen as a neutral or objective tool because what it does, it just reinvents or just perpetuates the status quo or the current model. And we can't, it doesn't necessarily uproot the current issues within our legal frameworks. It just builds on top of it and sort of just makes it more efficient. And the second key theme that came up after that was the commodification of data of Black communities. This was a really important topic to touch upon because in the literature, it stated that in facial recognition technology, Black faces were 100% more misidentified than their white counterparts. And what this means was that these AI tech firms and these policing institutions are going to invest more in having more accurate facial recognition technology. Although that sounds important that these technologies will be more important, but what that means is there'd be more surveillance around Black communities. There'd be more attention and policing focus and emphasis on acquiring Black data. Thirdly, another important topic that was outlined in this research report was the erasure of Black agency. When these tech firms or legal system institutions gather all this data about Black communities, the communities themselves don't necessarily have the agency or even the knowledge of what is happening to them. And the data is being manipulated or stretched and exploited in different ways that they're not aware of. And lastly, there's my illustrated version of the research report, which was really important for myself as I've done a lot of research on this topic already, and I haven't been able to get the opportunity, not even in university or my undergrad, where I was able to given the chance to illustrate and to kind of put more care and emphasis on my work. And thus being so, with this research report, I would say it's more accessible for the reader. It's a easier read and it's something that we happy to be published. And lastly, there's also an op-ed written piece would be my final deliverable in my Laidlaw Fellowship project. Here I drafted an op-ed written piece to focus more on the nuanced discussions of AI in the Black community as it relates to the perpetuation and reinvention of intergenerational trauma of the legal system. Here, I explored the ways in which intergenerational trauma experienced by racialized communities is not only passed down through lived experiences, but also perpetuated digitally through biased algorithms, online surveillance, and exclusionary narratives in the digital space. I argued that the digital realm, far from being neutral, often mirrors and amplifies systemic inequalities, embedding trauma into the platforms, tools, and technologies we use every day. The piece called for a more intersectional approach to digital justice, one that acknowledges historical trauma and actively works to disrupt its reproduction through inclusive, community-centered tech policy. And moving to the reflections of the fellowship, um, beginning with the challenges, I would say one of the earliest and most persistent challenges I faced was the tension between access and legitimacy being taken seriously in academic policy spaces while also remaining grounded in the lived realities of racialized communities. There were moments where it was hard to access this information, not only because of the lack of it, but also it was gatekept behind these financial institutions. And secondly, another challenge I faced throughout my Laidlaw Fellowship was the be able to effectively manage my time with current responsibilities, but also because of the time or like the time allotted time we had weekly to work on our projects. There was a sort of like start nature of working on the project. Um, and I think it made it a bit difficult to start to pick up where I left off from the previous week. But moving on to the breakthroughs of throughout this fellowship was having the opportunity to facilitate a roundtable discussion on the role of AI. And this was a moment of synthesis of taking all the reading and theorizing and reflecting on what I've done and turning it into a live collaborative space, which I really enjoyed. What stood out to me the most wasn't the quality of the conversation, but the diversity of the perspectives. Some attendees had a deep legal or technological expertise, while others had the approach of a more personal or community-based standpoint. And hearing from people who are directly impacted by legal surveillance or who have family members entangled in the bias system reframed my own understanding of what's at stake. And one community member even stated what stuck with me was that AI seems like it's designed far away, but the way it touches our lives is right here. And that grounded reminder of how seemingly like, abstract tools can have real world effects solidified that the work that I was doing really mattered. And thirdly, a moment of growth was that it throughout this research project and to this point, I think it really instilled confidence in my work and my in my advocacy as well. Um, And coming into this project, I sometimes questioned whether my contributions would hold weight because I'm still early in my journey of navigating research spaces and still building experience. But I would say this opportunity showed me that the work I've done is not only timely, but it's also necessary. And when I think about the future of the Canadian legal system, it's clear that the intersection of artificial intelligence and racialized communities will be a defining issue, even more than it already is. And while conversations around AI and race are starting to gain more traction in academic and tech spaces, I think the finer details, such as like the policy nuances, the lived implications, the advocacy for inclusion in specific systems, like the criminal legal system, still aren't getting the attention they deserve. And this project really allowed me to dig into those overlooked spaces and to shine a light on the importance of racialized voices, not just in the ethical debates around AI, but in the actual development and implementation of the tools that will impact real lives. And in doing so, I found something very validating about the work I was doing, such as when I was facilitating the roundtable, when I published my report, and when I heard back from participants who felt seen or learned something new, I realized that the work I'm doing is already making an impact. It affirmed to me that this isn't just like an academic theory. This is not just a social issue I'm going to study and write down in a report and submit, but it's actual advocacy. It's community care, and it's a contribution to a growing movement of like young, racialized thinkers and leaders who are determined to shape a more just future. And I was proud that I was able to contribute to that. And moving on to future directions, I'm excited to continue building on this work, not just as a researcher, but as someone who hopes to work directly in the legal domain, and eventually practice law. My long-term goal is to contribute meaningfully to a legal system that is more accessible, equitable, and future ready. The research I've done on AI and racialized communities has given me a strong foundation, not just understanding the risk of emerging technologies, but in identifying where real opportunities for systemic changes lie. One of the next projects I'm hoping to pursue is focused more on supporting legal aid offices, particularly through collaborations with tech firms. I want to explore how we can use AI and legal tech not to replace lawyers, but to enhance the capacity of legal aid systems, especially for those who can't afford legal representation. So that was just a general recap and a reflection of my experiences in the Laidlaw Foundation with a brief overview of the key milestones. And thank you all for listening so much.
Yes, Mike. Thank you, John, for your deeply insightful presentation. It's incredibly exciting to hear how your work pushes the boundaries of justice and technology. I know we're up for time, but I don't know if you guys have one or two questions you would like to ask our presenters. Feel free to raise your hand or type your questions in the chat if you're joining us virtually. Yeah.
I feel like AI is very far down. It's emergent, but it's quite far down the road. And it seems to be drawing primarily on experience. And so how at this juncture do you sort of, are there interventions that can be made that help balance it out and might equalize voices in a way that has not happened to date? And assuming that I'm correct in my supposition, feel free to challenge.
Very good question. Who wants to take that?
I'm sorry, just the audio cut out just at the very end. What was the very end of the question?
So supposing that AI has been developed primarily by white, and that there seems to be a dearth of Black voices and Black representation, and it's drawing upon sort of, I think, Kenneth, as you said, the sort of eugenics-based data of Black people. How at this juncture do you balance that out? How do you intervene? What needs to happen in order to get a better representation into?
Did you get that, John?
Yeah. I can chime in first. I thank you for that very insightful question, and that is a very real issue I think I've had across many of the presentations I've had so far with the participants. And one of the key recommendations I outlined in the research report was having a community-based auditing group that is empowered by the municipality. So they're able to actually make change and they have decision-making powers, and they're also authorized to see the data that's being used and to see the technology that is being employed by such as the policing institutions. Because other than that, I find it very difficult um, to trust the legal institutions or policing institutions to recognize for themselves that the data that is being used is objective or equitable and does not stand on the pillar of white supremacy and how it has oppressed, racialized, most specifically Black and Indigenous groups in the past.
Thank you. Any other questions, or did you want to try to respond? Or
Say a few.
sure.
Okay, so, can you guys hear me? So, there are multiple instances that take shape, and the first premise is the fact that AI is still far ahead. No, it's not. It's already here, right? And if it's here, that means we have Black scholars like Roa Benjamin and Tishum that are already creating recommendations as to centering Black people with disabilities or Black and brown people with disabilities into the gathering of data, into the creation of this artificial intelligence um, technologies. In fact, I have a friend at U of T right now that is working on the ways by which you can read Black people's skin on watches, right? And what it then gets is the way by which it gets this controlled sample of Black people. Knowing test that technology out and then to see how it works out. So there's that step in terms of having those Black voices, minority voices, the research stage. But there's also the sense of the responsibility of governments, like using documents like PPW, right? To ensure that we're able to control this big data. Right now, it seems that they're winning because they have this kind of overarching power in terms of how they choose to manage data. In fact, what Johne said, when the era of techno-feudalism, where like the technocrats is one that was really true connection for our data, what then needs to happen is that each and every person needs to know about data and privacy, what they're given in anything. They need to read, like when you see the your cookies, you need to read what is going on, what kind of data are you allowing in that sense, right? But also incumbent on government to create policy, disciplinary policies to control the way big data companies operate, even break them. We had the opportunity under Obama to break them, but we didn't. And now they have a lot of freedoms. But that is also one way on systemic level.
Yes.
So I have a question. So yeah, my question is more on like the data. You guys excellently brought up like the fact that our data is being used or monetized. It's also being commodified. I just wanted to know, like, in your research, where have you come across like the data being like mined? Like, for example, right now we're training the models to include everything that's currently on the internet, but then there's like this battle. You only have so much stuff on the internet. Now it becomes like a lot of these tech companies, they're looking for ways to mine new data, to create new data, to like basically one way this could be done would be like, for example, advertisement companies, they'll throw ads your way in your algorithm and they'll see based on what you react to, like they're creating new data. So like, yeah, like what would you tell a person interested in actually knowing how your data is being mined? Like what are some things that we could like be mindful of? And what are some things that like you would say that folks with disabilities might be specifically vulnerable within this process of that?
Yeah, I can chime in very quickly. I think that some of these firms kind of prey on the fact that we're ignorant towards the collection of our data. And I believe that there's somewhat of a larger responsibility on the state to enshrine and uphold our privacy rights as it is like a quasi-constitutional right that we reserve. And it's harder for a layperson to understand the gravity of the situation and what their data actually can be used or how it can be used against them. and it can be manipulated and exploited even by these firms. But I think having like educational campaigns or just a greater legal education um, would be a great way to reach out to like public individuals about it. But I think there's a twofold recommendation. Would be one, yeah, having more education about privacy rights and legal education, but also having stronger and really upholding our privacy rights, and that is by responsible of the state.
I just two things. The first one is how do we know about our data in examples of with our data in mind. So in every area of the criminal justice system right now, data is being taken either through your zip code, your postal code. That is data. And so what happened in policing is that because you have the zip code and this zip code shows you the areas that are tend to be high prone or high crime areas. So like Jane and Finch might have the N9B or Rexdale might have the N9B. That is data collected by the police departments to prove that that community is a high crime. In fact, they did a study in Australia whereby say in Australia, in Texas, whereby the Texas police officers used students who were suspension data to look at students who were high criminal activity. It wasn't necessarily allowed in a sense. So data has been collected from multiple places that we're not necessarily thinking about this data. And that is because I would also blame the academic society because this entire information has mainly been within this academic silo. It hasn't necessarily been oversaturated into the general community as to what John said. How can communities know better about know data education better in a sense? So with that aspect in policing, in fact, Immigration and Refugee Board also uses automated decision-making systems to make who comes to this country, who doesn't, who get rejected, who doesn't, and they're not necessarily they're very biased and not necessarily transparent. So in that case, data has always been collected. I can show you evidence here. This has happened since 2014. In terms of solutions, as we still go back to governmental responsibility, I know that the legal system, they brought out a report recently to showcase what has been happening. A really tough document, like 100 pages. That is the first step. But the main impetus should be on the government. People need to mention the MPs talk about racial intelligence. What are the strengths? It's not I see racial intelligence in two spaces. A site for possibilities. You can use it to help people, black people with disabilities, but there's still questions that we need to ask because the foundations, think about the systems, are heavily deep in anti-black racism, are deep in colonialism, are deep in the rejection of persons with disabilities. And so we need to start thinking about that effectively, unless we seek to replicate the same systems that we've tried to be against for so long.
I don't think we have any more time for more questions.
I have.
Oh, yeah, okay.
We have
Please.
You both, this is wonderful, but from a foundation's perspective, what do you think we should be doing with this? What's next for us and for you?
Should I go, Ron?
Yeah, you can go first. Sorry, I had trouble hearing the question.
What's next from your perspective and for us also a foundation, where do you think we should go with this?
I'll just go quickly. From a foundation perspective, I think it's important to begin funding more research into this conversation and into the ways by which these new technologies have afflicted some of the most marginalized moments. I've had that that blind spot where we call it epistemic injustice, where I wasn't really effectively thinking about people with disabilities while doing research before. And that is because the research, when you go into the research, there is no data. Or we do have the data, but that data is not being released in any sense. I think it's just recently in 2024, we got the employment data. So more research needs to be more funding into research. And this niche, for instance, the court system. How do Black people with disabilities get treated within the court system? Black and brown people get treated within the court system. people don't really know how, and it's in two things: remand, which is where people, black people with disabilities or brown and black indigenous people are denied bails in essence because they cannot afford it. Right? No one really talks about bail reform or the administration of justice offenses, whereby the minor charges the result of the social norms that we tend to regulate through state police. There's not enough research. In fact, there's no recent data on pre-trial sentencing detention in any case. So in every sport, from houselessness to now we're having the debate on involuntary treatments, the data is not there. We're having debates based on the fact that there's not enough data. So more research funding needs to be into discipline that are studying it, and that research cannot be locked up in disciplinary silos. It has to be saturated towards the community. So from a foundation standpoint, I think more funding to research, more funding into youth research, talk about these new developments, but disability is not the only thing. There's also what happens to those with intellectuals? What happens to those with psychiatric disabilities? I was looking at psychiatry research while doing this, and psychiatry research right now is disappointing, right? And so we need to start looking at this niche research to show how they're one of the most marginalized. Personally, I'm going to continue in law school.
John?
All right, so I know we're tight on time, so I'll try to answer that very quickly. But I think moving forward, I agree with Kenneth on that we need to have more research and to invest more invest more into racialized researchers who are looking into these issues. For example, when I was doing my research in the literature review, as I've stated before, that there was a lack of engagement with the community and methods of like semi-structured interviews where we're able to hear directly from them, and the data that is being garnered is from the community. I think there just needs to be more engagement from the academic realm and working with these communities or the public more in the sense of because it not only lets us hear from their perspective, but it also educates them at the same time about the issues that they're being asked about. And secondly, I think that municipalities, like if we're going on a municipal level, they should empower such committees such as what I've said before, empowering a community-based committee so that they can audit and review AI tools that the policing institutions want to employ themselves. So rather than having the policing institutions be the ones to do their own reviewing, I believe the city should have a committee that can have that power and is delegated that role and authority to audit it for themselves.
Thank you, John.
So what does it say? Can this information be presented to the high school that they would like to talk about that? So they're asking them who they can talk about. This link will find search. And then the other question
If you
is,
invite them, Marcia, they'll come. And speak on your behalf. I think that's a good question in terms of the dissemination, like what we plan to do with this.
this was the other question. Laidlaw just research, or is there options to invest in AI development?
Investing in AI might be a bit beyond us, but research and obviously the thesis of what Kenneth and it's quite relevant to the intersectionality of race, education around consumer justice, education and child welfare system. So that space is
Amazing. So with that, I will thank you all for your thoughtful questions and for being part of today's conversation. On behalf of Laidlaw Foundation, I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to Kenneth and John for their courage, creativity, and commitment to justice Your work embodies the spirit of the Nathan Gilbert Youth Innovation Fellowship. So thank you. We look forward to sharing more updates on their research with all of you guys, and we invite you to stay connected with us as we continue to support youth-led changes. Thank you. So please continue reading. Thank you to everyone who's online.
Thank you all so much for having me.